So my name is Chloe Howenstein, and I'm the coordinator of the SICE Development Roundtable series. Thank you for joining us for today's talk with Dr. Robert Klitgaard. For more than a dozen years, the Development Roundtable series has provided a forum for informed discussion of trends facing the development community. This event gives speakers the opportunity to address the challenges of global development and to suggest new initiatives that will help improve the field. Dr. Klitgaard will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And now I would like to introduce Dean Peter Lewis, who will be introducing Dr. Klitgaard.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to everybody. We're really delighted and very pleased and honored to be joined by Professor Robert Klitgaard. Professor Klitgaard is probably known to most of the people in the room. He has been a long-time author, commentator, analyst on issues of development, policy, and governance. He's the author, most notably, among more than 10 books, I think, of Tropical Gangsters, which has been cited by the New York Times as one of the books of the century, and Choosing Elites, which has been named in the Harvard Guide to Influential Books, among many others. And for many of us, Tropical Gangsters has certainly been foundational, and your subsequent commentary and analysis in multiple countries has been something that we've paid quite a bit of attention to, so thank you. Robert Klitgaard is the university professor at Claremont Graduate University, where he served as president from 2005 to 2009. Before joining the Claremont Graduate University, he was the dean of the Pardee Rand Graduate School, which is America's leading PhD program in public policy, where he was also the Ford Distinguished Professor of International Development and Security. He has, in addition, taught at Yale, at the School of Management, and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, which some of you may have heard of. It's one of our lesser competitors. Dr. Klitgaard advises countries around the world on governance reform and economic strategy. His professional work and research has taken him to more than 35 countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. His recent international partners range from environmental nonprofits to supreme audit authorities, from the World Bank to the OECD, from the government of Sonora, Mexico, to the Institute of Directors in Thailand, from the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Austria to the Royal Institute for Governance and Strategic Studies in Bhutan. He has participated in the World Economic Forum as a faculty member and as a member of the Global Agenda Council, and he just recently spent his sabbatical year divided between Oxford and most recently the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He is currently working on a book called What Will Work Here, as you can see reflected in the title of today's talk, about rethinking the way we analyze and evaluate policies, and he'll be discussing that with us today. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So a warm welcome for Robert Klitgaard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out during midterm week. The draw of food, part of the deal, right? So I understand that. If you have to leave early, that's okay. I understand. Perhaps wait till I get about 2 minutes in, then you're allowed to leave. So here is, did we have the one I sent you this morning? Oh, yes. Yes. Okay, so this is it. I may have to sneak a peek every now and again. So we have the microphone on there? Okay, can you guys hear me still? Okay. There we go. There we go. So the objectives of policy research, broadly speaking, are trying to make better decisions that can be implemented. And what I'm going to talk about today is a movement away from telling people what to do and trying to use analysis to help them be more creative and adaptive to their own circumstances. So the classic model I think we have of policy analysis as a decision maker like a governor who has a well-defined objective function. She knows what she wants. She has 3 alternatives, also well-specified. She invites you to come do some analysis to help her figure out which is the best alternative. I don't want to block you guys off over here. can see too. What's the best alternative? And she asks you to look at the economic consequences, the social consequences, the implementability, the political pros and cons. And you come back with your analysis and say, do B, and it works, and you shake hands, everybody says, policy analysis. And yet there's a lot of disappointment in policy analysis. I teach 2 courses this spring. One of them is on benefit cost analysis, graduate course, mostly economics students, PhD students in economics. And it's about how you can think about social costs and benefits beyond what the market says in places where you've got things like statistical lives and wilderness areas and equality. How do you ever put those in there and help people make more disciplined decisions? Second course is on policy design and implementation, which is also directed at people trying to make better policy choices. It could be NGOs and businesses as well as government agencies. And normally when I announce those courses to friends and students and colleagues, they like that. It has the bouquet of rationality amid ignorance and narrow political interests. And so it's not hard to motivate people to be appreciative of such courses. But I think, as you may know, the tide has somewhat changed. The bouquet has the aroma of arrogance, experts telling us what to do, biases toward public solutions to problems instead of other kinds of solutions, and studies which are presented as being conclusive and yet have weak models, weak data, perhaps some p-hacking in the background, and everybody's wondering what is the applicability of the social sciences to real problems. We also have been sniffed out for our biases. Turns out that professors aren't as unbiased in our policy research as we would hope. Radical solutions are often left aside. Words are used in interesting ways without explanation. For example, access, instead of being an opportunity to use a public service or be able to buy green vegetables or whatever it might be, becomes actual use, or even the results of the use. American leadership is stated as an objective as if it's sort of sacrosanct. Diversity is defined along a very narrow band of possible areas of interest, and the trade-offs of more diversity representation for such and such a group and less for another is seldom discussed. So with all that, when they think we are arrogant, overselling our models, biased, and unreliable, then no wonder we have a problem. So the question is, what can we do about this situation? So there is a demand for better research. Everywhere you go, there's evidence-based X, Y, and Z. Here from the Trump administration budget, the paragon of rationality and evidence-based decision-making, the budget calls for more evidence. We want to have evidence at the heart of everything we do. We don't know the needs, got to know what works. What works, isn't that a great one? And what does not work? In public policy more broadly, in the field of international development, you see a lot of calls for this too, and yet there's a gap between what we have and what we have is used and the purported demand. Let me give you a couple of examples. You know that the United Nations had this conference on the next, after the Millennium Development Goals, what's the next stage? And one of the surprises, according to one commentator, was the emphasis on evidence. In fact, the statisticians came together, and at the end of a conference led by the Secretary General, they said, "Statisticians of the world, unite." It became a rallying cry because data and evidence was so needed. And this is a rather typical overstatement of what we do. If only we could get more evidence, it could change development. We just need to do it. We need to figure out what works so we don't have so much waste. Here's a little bit older rendition of the same thing. For decades, development agencies had disbursed billions of dollars for programs aimed at improving living conditions and reducing poverty. Developing countries themselves, of course, have spent a lot. Yet the shocking fact really sends a tremor down your spine is that we have relatively little knowledge about the net impact of most of these programs. In the absence of good evidence, what happens? Of course, politics and ignorance and narrow interests start to predominate. But if we had this evidence systematically collected, assembled, put together by us, elite policy analysts, if we could do that, then it could be used for better public policy making. more broadly. And yet there's a problem. Even when we have policy analyses, they're not used. So you say, wait a second, we need evidence-based decision-making. It's absolutely crucial for what we do. And yet when we have it, you don't use it. So what's the problem here? Well, on the one side, you see statements like this from one of the world's leading evaluators, Carol Weiss, who says, even when we have a great evaluation, it's not used. Occasionally you see something very narrow gauge which will affect a decision about where the garbage truck route ought to run in a city. But seldom do big studies of big issues end up making any discernible mark on the substance or direction of policy. Wow. Eugene Bardach's book you may have seen, The Eightfold Path, maybe you've studied that one. The 4th edition, I got a call from Gene. He called me up and said, look, my publisher has asked me, do you have an exemplar of the policy analysis you're telling people to do? And he says, I'm stuck. Do you have one? Wow. So what's the problem? If there's so much need, what's going on here? Well, on the one hand, there's the supply side. Okay, so let's pretend like we're decision makers now, and we look over at these academics who only care about their journal publication. They only care about their models. They only care about going so far as, here's the finding. What's the policy implication? Not my business. So the studies are not on time, they're too recondite, they're too arcane, they're too theoretical, and so forth and so on. They don't really understand the context in which they take place. They don't take the realistic situation of practitioners into account. Have you heard that before? On the other side, you'll see this. The supposed appetite for evidence is illusory. These guys don't want evidence. They want to keep their programs intact. They don't want any threat from an evaluation of what works. Nor do politicians really care to know what the evidence is, except to justify what they already want to do. So the idea that there's this huge demand for evidence out there is nonsense. And so we are not to blame. We're producing the studies. They don't care. Wow, really? So as an antidote to this, we might say, like Bardach's publisher, what are examples of policy research that's made a big difference? So when I was dean at the Rand Corporation, 700 PhDs or PhD equivalents working on problems from international development to local city development, from international security to health. It's America's biggest health research program, education, crime, so forth. I asked all the directors of these programs, so what's an example of a piece of research we've done in your area that's really made a big difference? And your answer is, what do you mean made a big difference? Question. And so my answer was, what do you mean made a big difference? So you go talk to your peers, and you nominate studies. So we had 28 studies nominated. They range from studies of the Soviet Empire breaking down, to studies of gays in the military, to studies of work for the auto companies on helping their workers make better choices about health insurance policies, across the board. And it was fascinating. We did a course you'd like, I think, for second-year students after you've done all your push-ups in the econometrics and economics and modeling and so forth. Now you have a course where on Thursday you come to class and we give you a pseudo request for proposal, 1 page. Secretary of Defense, not the real one, wants you to do a study. You have $1 million, a study of gays in the military. Well, who do you want in your team and what would you do? And you have to write a 1-page memo by Sunday night. Well, no, not a lot of pressure on you, just write something. And Sunday night, I get that, I'm your professor, and the people who did the study get that. So on Tuesday when we have class, we come in and we've read this carefully, and so we orchestrate the discussion. I noticed you said you'd immediately do a survey of gay people who are in the military. And I noticed you start off with, you look at old, and so forth, and we have a discussion of what the researchers are right there. You have to promise you won't read their study until Tuesday night. At the end of that class, we give you the study, and now another 1-pager. What was the strongest point of this study, in your opinion? And what would you do if you had another $1 million? And then on Thursday, we have a discussion of that. Notice not what is your critique of this study. Very easy to be critical. Much more fun to talk about the positive. And in any case, when you come to class and you say, I thought that was the best part, and somebody else says, I didn't think that was so good. You get the negatives out there, but the context is very different. Researchers are there to kind of talk about the ideas and how they thought about it. And then the last 45 minutes, well planned in advance, we actually talk to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So we have 45 minutes of Q&A, and I get to ask the first question. In this case, it was, you had this study about gays in the military. We recommended that you include them, and you did don't ask, don't tell. So you didn't follow the recommendations of the study. In what sense, then, is it a successful piece of policy research? It doesn't fit the paradigm. I said do B, you didn't do B. So how's that successful? And the secretary said, you know, that's not, I told you it was successful, it's true. Every time anybody comes to this issue, from any side of the political spectrum, be a congressman person, an activist, a person in the military, comes to this issue, we give them this study because it lays out the pros and cons, what's known and not known. It's sort of an encyclopedia that we can use to get people started on the same page. So our class goes, that's a good study. That had a big impact. And it goes on from there. One of the ones I liked best was the auto study. We had people embedded with the 3 automobile makers at that time, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, and the auto union. They'd get together every week and talk about the different health plans. If you were an auto worker, you got 43 plans to choose from. And they're complicated. I mean, you and I would have trouble choosing. And so, you don't know how to do it. And the company says, number 7's really good. But you're thinking, does the company have my best interests in mind here? I don't think so. So Rand helped with, in the background, develop a system where you get ratings of quality, access or coverage, and cost. You get those 3 dimensions, and you get 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 stars tailored to you. So you're a 26-year-old house person, husband and wife, you got 3 kids, you type that in, no known diseases, and then back comes, here are the programs ranked by these 3 different dimensions. You're a 60-year-old person, your kids are already gone, here's your needs, you have this chronic condition, and it comes back with answers. So that was a big success, and we talked to the auto worker, one of the auto worker representatives, and was on this telephone call. So we talked about why this was successful and so forth. But then the auto worker guy said something that really caught my attention. He said, the real benefit of this study was we worked together over this 6-week or 6-month period, and we developed trust, which has now carried over to other issues that the auto companies and the workers faced. We have learned to talk with each other, to listen to each other, and to be analytical about matters that we're contentious with. So wow, that's cool. So we did these studies, and then we invited 7 think tanks from around the world, from China to Namibia, to Central Europe, to Mexico, to come. And the same question, what's been your most successful, what's a piece of research made a big difference? And you say, what do you mean made a big difference? And I say, what do you mean made a big difference? And so they all came together in Santa Monica, had a lot of fun. And final point is that none of the 28, maybe one of the 7 international, but none of the 28 fit the standard model of policy analysis. None of them fit that idea of here's the choice made by the governor with these alternatives, and here's the analysis, and they did it. So if it didn't do that, what did they do? What does success mean here? Instead, it meant something quite different. It helped them rethink and redefine the problem. What is the problem here? Maybe they got the problem wrong, and maybe the research helped them reframe what they were trying to do. Or maybe it expanded the objectives. They really hadn't thought, we assume they have the utility function, right? But they don't. And so the research helps them by giving them other ideas, other examples that help them go, wow, okay, I hadn't thought about my objectives quite hard enough. Or maybe those 3 alternatives get amplified. There's more alternatives than that, different alternatives that they hadn't thought of. Oftentimes there's data developed which are used in flows of information in subsequent decisions. And as sometimes it's this bringing together of, quote, stakeholders, a word I despise, but since it's widely used, we'll use it. You get these people together in a place where the analysis helps them rethink the problems themselves. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And finally, building some networks that last, where the researchers can be in touch down the road with future tranches of information, and communities of practice can begin to emerge that are well informed by policy research. So this led to creative problem solving. It did not lead to, we recommend B, please do it. It led to them coming up with answers that we, the researchers, may not have even envisioned. Isn't that cool? So it's a whole different thought about what we're trying to do here. So let me give you an example. This is Tagalog for where there's no corruption, there'll be no poverty. And this was the campaign slogan of Benigno Aquino III when he ran for president in 2010. And he asked, when he came into this country of then 92 million, now 100 million people, he got to be president, he's got the campaign slogan, he's going, oh, now what do I do? And he has an excellent cabinet. During his inaugural speech, the only thing he said was, we're going to have a hotline. If you have a problem, you call up 1-900, no corruption. And they had 1,500 reports, and he had his new Minister of Finance, and he said, could you take this over, please? Minister of Finance goes, I don't know what to do with complaints about corruption. So they had a secret day-long convening in Malacañang Palace that I was privileged to facilitate. And in this meeting, they looked at three things. They looked at facts about the Philippine situation, facts from outside that help calibrate the dimensions we have in the international data that help locate their situation in terms of competitiveness, what things people say are really in bad shape and in good shape, and some are good and some are bad. It turns out governance is one of the bad ones. So they can see it not just as moralistic issue, let's clean up corruption, but as something that is inhibiting their economy and inhibiting their development. Then they get some frameworks of which it recast the problem of good governance as a problem not as ethics and culture, but as one of economic structures and prisoners' dilemmas and things like this, which help them go, you mean we're not just terrible people? No, not at all. It's not a moral issue. It's a good people trapped in bad situations. And then examples of success from other places which have faced systemic corruption and have succeeded. And the examples are taught in a particular way, what I call a live case, where you sit down and present it for 10 or 15 minutes, a description of this other situation. Maybe you have a handout of one page, and then you put them in groups of 4. Say you have 45 minutes, what would you advise the new president to do? And these guys are good. This cabinet is good. They come back with terrific ideas, even though they don't know much about the country. They did Colombia in 1998. Yesterday we did this at the IMF. Yesterday morning I did the same case for them. And they were good. They came back with stuff the Colombian president would have been happy to have them in the room, just like they would here. But the point of this, of course, is not to solve Colombia's problems. It is to say, so how does this exercise help you with your problems? And the first thing, well, Colombia and Philippines are different in these ways. And then somebody else says, but it's really interesting how they began here and how they didn't do this and how they sidelined some opposition this way and how they collect, etc. Then we have an imaginary news story 5 years from now. Philippines' great success. One page, lots of imaginary quotes and data. It says continued, page A9. But there is no page A9. They read this aloud, sentence by sentence, and at the end of that, they're applauding. Yes! Because it's finally not all the things that could be wrong, here's something that could be right. And then you say, so, Deborah, how do you think we could get from here to there? Not a prediction, but if I told you that happened, what is a chain of events that could have led to that? Could you spend 10 minutes on that, please? Write down your list. Could you spend 10 minutes, please? Could you? Everybody spends 10 minutes and writes it down. And then in pairs, would you please share with Dean Lewis your ideas? And you listen carefully because I want you to give back to the group what you think her best idea was. And then you'd give her your ideas and you give back the best. And all those best get written up on a board. And they're pretty good. It's pretty exciting. So then we ask the question, so what do you guys have to do in the next 6 months to make some of these things happen? And they come up with ideas I never would have thought of because they know the context. And it's their creativity also. They're experts. Well, anyway, they stayed till 8 o'clock that night. They appointed a team of 3 ministers to work Sunday and Monday and go to the president on Tuesday with a draft strategy, which led to amazing results. It's now, 2 years ago it was faster growing than China. It's now the 4th fastest growing country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And don't ask me about Duterte. So here's another example. Back around 2013, Clayton Christensen, a Harvard Business School professor who developed the theory of disruptive innovation, was asked by Andy Grove at Intel to come out and address the board at Intel to tell how the theory of disruptive innovations applied to the chip business. So Clayton Christensen started off saying, okay, let's start. And then he thought, he had sort of an epiphany. You know, I'm not going to do the chip industry. I'm going to tell them a theory-laden story about another industry which exhibits this process of disruptive innovation and see how they capture it. So he goes there for this lunch and all these board members, and he starts off this story about another industry. He did not tell the chairman of Intel in advance. He was expecting to talk about the chip industry. But Andy Grove adjusted, probably grumbling a little bit, and started getting interested in this other story. And about 2/3 of the way through the meeting, Grove said, okay, I got it. You guys got it? Everybody goes, yep. And then Christensen reports, Grove and company applied Christensen's theory to their industry better than I ever could have. And he says, I've drawn some conclusions about this. Whenever anybody asks me what I should do, I don't answer them directly. I don't say, do B. We've done the analysis. I'm a doctor, trust me. Instead, I give them a story that's full of a theory and how their problem, something like their problem played out somewhere else, and I find they get it, and they then figure out their answer better than I could have. I find that a powerful story for the things you and I do, and an exemplar for how we should behave. So, it's more than the decision. It's much more like, how do we get people together to think about goals and possibilities? It's more than the choice. It could be a series of choices made by a bunch of different people. And I want to give you an example from healthcare. So during the revolution, I guess there's been a revolution, you could say, in measuring quality of care that combines what patients say about how they feel, what experts say when they look at the charts, was that the right diagnosis and what was that the right treatment given what you have there, and what you could say about outcomes down the road, something like morbidity and mortality. You take those three and try to put it together, and they developed a system, and Don Berwick at Harvard developed this along with people at Rand. So Berwick had a workshop series where he brought together, you guys are the health system of Texas, back here is Louisiana, you're from Southern California, you come back with your team, and you agree to come for 3 days. And the first day you get hands-on instruction on how this system works, no theory. He said they don't listen to theory, they want to do things. Okay, so he does this. At the end of the second day, you go home at night and you're expected to come back the next morning and brief the group about what you're going to do when you go back. So you guys all work in your room that night, you come in the next day and you make a briefing, and everybody comments on it, and then you go home. And for the next 2 weeks, the phones are open. The professor's ready to hear anything you have as you go back. But the crucial thing is, you have also agreed to come back 9 months hence. You can't get into the first one unless you come back for the second one. And in the second one, you come back and say, well, how'd it go in Texas? Louisiana, how'd you guys do? California? And you start telling, well, we had trouble with this. You did? We made that work. How'd you do that? And they start sharing stories about how things worked, what went wrong, what went right. The contexts are different. Problems sometimes are the same, though. And then at the end of the 2 days, they again have to say what they're going to do when they go back home. And once again, they present to each other. And now they have some friendships. And this has become a network of people who can then support each other down the road. So I have some incipient hypotheses here about policy analysis, or more broadly, policy research, evaluations, applications of social science to real problems that you and I do, how it can be more effective. We can bring it to policymakers. We can bring them data that help them locate their problem and understand their setting. How is it different? How is it the same? How does this problem look to other people? Secondly, we can bring them examples of success in other places that are relevant. That takes a lot of knowledge on our part. It takes a lot of listening to understand their issues before we even start on that. And third, we can bring them, such as we have, models, frameworks, theories that would help them reframe the problem creatively. And what I call convenings are sessions. It could be a day, it could be 2 days, away from the phones, a chance to talk about these issues, and with the goal of multiple actors addressing these issues and coming up with something that would have legs down the road. So convenings help in 2 ways. One of our paradigmatic problems in policy analysis is estimating the effect of delta X1 on Y, other things held, quote, constant. And we know about omitted variables, we know about endogeneity, we know about data problems of outliers, bimodal distributions, we know about long-tailed distributions, we know about different estimating techniques. Wait, did you do quintile estimation? Wait, did you do maximum likelihood? Wait, did you do probit? Wait, did you do, we know that, right? That's what we know about that. Know about that stuff. So there's an issue there which is confounded by the fact we don't know the local conditions. We might have a general model. The effect depends on the context. And we can say things like, is it an individualistic country or a hierarchical one? Or is it matriarchal or patriarchal? We might have some interaction terms there if we're smart. We might not. But the hope is that when you work with local people, they can, in effect, help you specify that equation, metaphorically speaking, and estimate those interaction effects. And also, it helps you create the ideas that are needed as solutions. So it's not just the estimate. The estimate goes into then, what do you do about that estimate? How do you do that? And we can suggest, well, raise a price, open access, more information. We have some general categories of things we know about. The Bardock book has a great list called What Governments Do. Wonderful checklist. If you have any policy problem, go through that checklist there. But they have ways of doing it that are much more attuned to reality, their reality. And if they do it, they own it. It's not the old thing I keep hearing about, well, if we don't have participation, they won't buy in to our solutions. We need their buy-in. Don't you hate that word? They got to basically agree with me. So I'll run this thing and pretend to listen, but really I want you to do, here's the answer, okay? Do it. It's not like that. This is much more creative, much more humble. So our goal, the way I put it, in my own simple-minded way to myself, we have to be humble and we have to be bold. We need humility about what social science can dictate about those if-then relationships. If we do this, then that will happen. You know what? Really? And we have to be bold in suggesting effects, models, stories that are helpful, ways to contextualize it for somebody else, data that might help them think about their problem more creatively. Bold and humble. You see that? I saw a gym down the street. What's it called? Monster Gym or something that says, train hard and be humble. Okay, that's not a bad motto for this talk. So this generates Policy Analysis 2.0, where here's the policy analysis version 1.0 that we saw before. Instead of one decision makers, now we got a lot of decision makers and stakeholders. Instead of one choice that you're talking, the choice, now you're talking about a whole stream of choices, and they have characteristics of unclear objectives, vague and fuzzy, maybe incomplete alternatives, etc. Needing data, examples, and frameworks that will kindle creative problem solving, not just the study, but they need it through convening and networking. So this is what I call policy analysis version 2.0. I'm getting to the end, where I'm going to get your help now. So building version 2.0, several questions arise. What process is best for doing this? You may know about PDIA. You may have studied that here. You may have seen stuff that involves some stuff like Suskind's things of consensus building. There's other processes that get people together. My thought is we're not doing enough hard research on this. And in 10 years, I believe we're going to know a lot more about what kinds of processes with what kinds of stakeholders for what kinds of problems work best. But for now, I have seen work, as well as fail, this technique of bringing the facts, the examples, and the models together in a friendly way that is both bold and humble. There are some frontier questions I have in this book I'm writing, which are three that are often overlooked, I believe, in policy analysis. The first one is taking culture into account. Culture is a word for economists. It's coming back into economics, but it's always been a thing, well, let's just leave that aside. Let's assume identical preferences, identical endowments, identical information. Let's just leave that aside for a moment and look at what we can say about market structures mattering for what people do. That's useful. Prices matter, incentives matter, and if we put that other stuff in there, it may cloud things up. But at some point, they become central, especially in fields like international development, especially when you get away from the capital cities. So how do we take culture into account? So I'm working actively on this subject and have some stuff in my book about this. Another one is disadvantage and stigma. We can have a policy that works in a certain setting for certain groups to come out with a result, but the policy itself may create a stigma. It may identify a disadvantaged group, and by identifying them may create incentives not to participate. And so how do we take that into account? And the third one is collaboration and partnership. Most of the big issues facing our cities, our country, many global issues are not going to be solved by government alone, nor by privatizing alone. It's not state or market anymore, if it ever was. It's going to be some sort of collaboration, if not partnership, at least awareness of what the other people are doing and some way to share information and priorities and maybe even to partner. And what I find in public policy programs, business schools, and so forth, we have not been good at training leadership or management of collaborative arrangements. No, we don't do it. So this book has a lot about that. I also have a course on public-private nonprofit partnerships where we look at a lot of success stories. And from those, we try to derive some rules of thumb. Now, in each of these areas, I find that this methodology of convening is a useful tool. Take cultural differences. It's a little hard for me as an analyst to put all the right cultural variables in my imaginary policy equation to estimate the effect of X1. I include all these variables. Much more interesting is to take some stuff into them and say, what do you think given your cultural realities? Because there are often more than one culture. Ditto with stigma. If you get the people who are stigmatized to help you design the program, help them implement it, and so forth. Indeed, if all policy research has the people we're trying to help involved from the design of the study, the identification of the problem, the collection of the data, the interpretation of the results, we're ahead of the game in terms of avoiding big irrelevancies that much of our research has. So let's talk about some of the implications for our work. I want to do an analogy here of expertise in general. I want to say there's expertise 2.0. So first, policy analysis 2.0. The goal is not just to tell people what to do. And maybe you can talk about pedagogy 2.0. It's not transferring a box of knowledge from my head to your head. Maybe if I'm talking 5th grade arithmetic, something like that is good. But when we're talking serious pedagogy, we're not talking about that. We're talking about something where I can bring you facts, theories, examples to kindle your power and your creativity. How about counseling 2.0 or being a shrink 2.0? It's not sit down on the couch, tell me your problems, I'll figure out that you're OCD, you're in love with your mother or whatever it is. And if you realize that, you'll go, oh my God, you're right, and then it's over. No, not like that. The counselor helps you identify your goals, helps you rethink your objectives, helps you be more creative about alternatives, shows you examples of other people that have had situations like yours. I was very impressed with the study of homeless youth, 15-year-old youth. The guy who's running this program, which has been quite effective, says the first thing I have to teach them is you are not alone. And that's important to know because if you agree that you're not alone, then when you see someone who has succeeded, who was like you, who can tell you a story about how they succeeded despite being a 15-year-old runaway, that's pretty cool. And there's evangelism 2.0, which is not about, look, there's a fourfold path, or there's a particular path to Mecca, or there's a particular thing you have to believe and do, and then you got it. It's more enabling people to see things, feel things, perceive things, understand things that they are struggling with that they haven't understood. So the goal of expertise 2.0 is not what Clifford Geertz famously called size up and solve social science. Great metaphor. Le fait social total of Marcel Mauss. Or Max Weber's complete systems analysis that would anticipate all the unintended consequences, which he thought was the goal of social science. It's not that. It's something more akin to soil science. And so I want to give you this metaphor of soil science. Soil science, not social science. So I'm going to exaggerate both. Soil scientists come in. Can I make you a farmer for a second? Okay. So I come in and say, listen, all you farmers over here, good to see you. Assalamu alaikum, how you guys doing? Look, I'm not here to tell you what to grow or how to grow it. Let me start off with that. You guys know far more about your land, your preferences, your tenure systems, your technologies, your histories, your land. You know far more than I'll ever know. I've got a few tricks, though. I can measure nitrogen content, phosphate, phosphorus, loam. Got a few other tricks. In about 2 hours, if you'll let me, I'll go out and take some tests and come back and show you some. Can I do that? You say, sure. Okay, go on it. So I go out and do these tests, come back, and then I come back with some numbers. 3.0, 16.8, 1.2. That's not enough, is it? Good for my journal article, but not enough for him. What he needs is something like a book, which I would have, which says, let me show you some, or a spreadsheet in n dimensions. It says, soils like this, look what grows well. By the way, what are you growing now? Soybeans, okay. Well, it turns out not soybeans, it's Calabasas, it's pumpkins. You like pumpkins? Not particularly, right, okay. Okay, but if you grew pumpkins here, and by the way, it also says some things that are really bad for here. And you know what one of them is? Soybeans. Okay. So luckily for you, I've got another book, which is, with this kind of soil, given that you want to grow soybeans, here's what you can do in soil treatment. Irrigation, fertilizing, cross-cropping, pesticides, here's what you might do. So you can adapt your crop to the soil that you have, or you can adjust your soil to the crop you want, or clearly there's both of those in play. Now think of the analogy for policy work. We go somewhere and we say, listen, I don't understand your setting, your goals, anything like this, but I've got a few tricks. I've got a few models I can show you. I've got a few simulations of cues I can show you. I've got a few stories I can show you from other places. And if you let me do some evaluation, I can try to show you, here are some other places that have a situation like yours who wanted to do that. Here's where the crucial situations were. Here's another kind of policy that might work better given your setting. So for example, if you're in Guinea and you're in the Fouta Jalon, which is very hierarchical, and you want a credit system, watch out that the rich guys don't take it over. If you're in the lowlands, very individualistic, you don't have to worry about that so much. If you're in the forest region where it's very collectivistic, you might want to have some group guarantees, but that wouldn't work very well down in the lowlands. So you might adjust your credit program to those cultural realities. So it's a nice, humble goal. And then you leave the farmer with that information. By the way, here's my email. Let me know if I can be helpful to you. It's you have sovereignty over this problem, and you may or may not use what you're taught. So point 2, this leads to different questions we ask. At the end of your master's thesis or your policy analysis exercise or your summer internship, you've got your results. They've asked you to figure out what would happen if I did this, something like a policy analysis 1.0. You should also ask, are there any things I could do from this research that would help people reframe the problem? Are they stuck in a rhetorical circle somehow here about the if and then and back and forth on gun control or something, and they haven't thought about it in a different way which would help them get a little more creative? Is there anything I've done in my research that would help people rethink the objectives? Is there anything I can do, maybe using analogies from other areas of policy, that would help them add alternatives that they haven't thought of? Is there any way that my research could be used in some kind of convening process? And is there a way that if we got research like this into a pipeline, people could develop confidence and competence over time? And then there's implications for your university and mine. First of all, we talk about teaching, research, and service. Maybe we ought to think about convening on big issues. When I think about big issues, who's going to do it if we don't? Now, you could say government should do it. Maybe. They have that 4-year electoral horizon. Business can help. They can give us money to do it, but oftentimes they have trouble convincing the board of directors it's a useful thing to think about a problem that's 10 years in a long-term process. Foundations can help. They often don't have enough money, or they have their own biases and slants they want to reinforce. So universities, although we are not pristine in terms of our biases, and we have very limited funds, I think we are a place that should think about developing this capability. I think, therefore, we should think about what physical facilities and virtual facilities we need, how we should organize our research to focus on a few big problems, and I don't mean 10, I mean 2 or 3 that we're going to do this, continue to do all other research, but let's pick a couple of things that we're good at, that people need, and we think we can get some money for. And then what we teach, how we teach you, who are going to be the future people solving these problems. How do we bring policy analysis 2.0 in there? And what it involves is a little bit, it doesn't involve any lowering in rigor. You still have to do this work. You have to see how the models can help. You have to see a lot more stories, though, and you have to be a good storyteller. You have to be a good listener. You have to be a person to listen to people's problems very carefully before you even begin to do this. And there is a talent to running these convenings. There's a techniques that we can teach about how to do that, which might be a good part of research training and practical training. Well, let me stop there and get your thoughts about Policy Analysis 2.0. I know you midterm exam people, welcome to cut out now if you like. So who'd like to say something? Yes, miss. Sorry, lady in the back. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm an alumnus, so I'll go back to where we were, which was the 1.0. And whenever we said, oh, but wait, what about this? What about that? Follow our paradigm. Just do this. And we put everybody into this little box. And then we find out 20 years later, of course, we've left people out of the box. And this is where you come up with 2.0, which is great. I'm happy to see this evolution of thought. The key thing you said earlier, you don't like this word stakeholders. There are a lot of people always being left out of the room whenever we talk about analysis. How else do we bring these people in other than, well, look, I just want you to rubber stamp what I've told you need to do, whether it's in a community that doesn't want a bus lane on 16th Street, or whether it's a country 7,000 miles away where people want to define what their economy becomes.
Yeah, I don't like the word stakeholder. I love to have stakeholders. So I just wish there's another word to use besides stakeholders. Stakeholder sounds like somebody playing a gambling game, got high stakes. It sounds like somebody in a business arrangement where you have this stake in the thing, you have your skin in the game and so forth. I'd rather talk about partners or people who we're all together here trying to do something, but definitely want to get them in the room. That's part of the deal.
When you say this, you talk about partnerships, but you're still not giving them equality because you're convening, they're back here in the audience. They don't have a microphone,
Yeah.
they're back in the hall.
That's yeah. Not only that's not. I hear you though. If that's there, that's not acceptable. So, let's talk about this Philippine situation where the cabinet's here. So there are stakeholders. Or other situations you might have business, government, civil society, people. They are the agents, just like the farmer. They have sovereignty on this problem. My job in this event is not to dictate or even be the person behind the throne. It is to enable them through a process that brings data to them in a way they can grab it, brings examples to them in a way they can work it through and see, get creative ideas, and brings some frameworks to them, not to dictate an answer, but to help them reframe something. So it's more like social work. Maybe you don't like that word either. It's more like social work where you're trying to enable a group of people to solve a problem, and you do have a few tricks. You have some data, you have some frameworks, you have some stories. So that's what you bring to the table, but you're not bringing, I have the authority to tell you what to do. Not at all. Yeah. Yes.
I very much like your approach of sharing stories, tricks, experiences, theories from other places. My question is, how important is it to share success stories, and what would make a good success story? And I ask because it's very hard to find radical transformations of countries where a solution changed everything. I mean, life tends to be more complicated. So what's a good success story?
It's a great question. So we tend to have this idea of big bang. Suddenly we went from sinner to saved. Suddenly our economy was all distorted. Now it's in equilibrium and it's got a golden path moving forward. We're rather, I like to use a story. Can I just tell you about a 2-minute story from Vietnam, where about 15 years ago, Vietnam had opened up to the outside world, had a lot of foreign aid in there, and there was a group came in who was interested in childhood malnutrition. But there had been enough foreign aid there that the planning minister was resentful of all these Mitsubishi Jeeps and all the expense accounts, and told this newly arrived group, who had a small budget, working on child malnutrition, you've got to show me results in 6 months or out. So they could have taken the approach of what are all the causes of childhood malnutrition? And you could list 20. Poor water, ignorant peasants, bad food pricing, corruption, who knows what they would be. And you could say, without solving all these problems, it's a holistic, it's piecemeal approaches won't, you know that kind of stuff that we talk. But what they did instead is they went into 15 villages and they did some surveys with the local women, weighing the kids in those villages. And then they came back and asked the women, are there some kids that are better nourished than others? Yeah. Are there some of the very poorest kids, not the chief's daughter and son, who are well nourished? Yes. So let's find out how they do that. And to simplify, they found out that the undernourished group had the practice of 2 meals a day of rice. They'd all come together, 2 times a day. And if a kid was sick, it was in the back. They didn't wash their hands so well. The successful groups who had gotten the well-nourished kids had 4 meals a day, so the little tummies had more room to digest the food. They washed their hands. The mother would feed the ailing child at the table, and crucially, they would add shrimp, crabs, and sweet potato greens from their rice paddies and gardens into the food. So they found this out. Now, the next step was, how do we share this? Now, a typical professor might say, I will write an article for the American Journal of Public Health in English, and that'll do it, because it'll be out there in the literature, and I'll give a thanks in the footnote to my local collaborators with their names. But they won't be co-authors, they'll just be. But what they did there was, they invited people from 250 other villages to come in. First, they spread it around the village. They had groups of 50 come together to 10 of these houses. In 50 houses, groups of 10 would come together and have lunch together. So I was doing the 2 a day, you were doing the 4 a day, and we all talk about, hey, that tastes good. By the way, do you saute the crabs first, or how do you do that? Do you put a little garlic in there? What do you do with those sweet potato greens? How do you get them so, and so forth? And they feel, taste, and do it, and then they go back. Now they invited other villagers to come in from outside. And they used words like feel, touch, smell, taste, not get a PowerPoint briefing, not get a 10-point program from the government, and so forth. The result was, within 6 months, in the villages, the 250 villages that adopted this, there was a 65% reduction in malnutrition. And Emory University did an evaluation a few years later, and this had persisted because they'd learned something. Now, here's an example of a success story where it does not depend on the complete change in the whole system of food production, the integrated agriculture plan, right? It doesn't depend on a social revolution where people then have, it depends on some simple things that they can learn from and do. So a combination of stories like that, where you have some small things that can make a big difference, can be extremely helpful. So I have a whole bunch of these success stories which we use depending on the situation. Can be as simple as inviting people to tell you what's wrong and putting those data together to find the bright spots within the government that are already working in very bad situations. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Okay. Yes.
My name is Johannes. I work with Global Integrity. Huge fan of what you just laid out. And just to bolster that and to buttress that, we've been working along this type of thinking for the past 3 years, including with grantees and with other civil society organizations around the world. And it is a hugely promising approach, and I totally welcome you thinking about this and putting this out in terms of academia or universities also taking this up. I know there's a few others that are also following this type of thinking. I'd like to have perhaps some more reflection by you on the question of politics. How do you conceive of politics when you lay out your thinking around policy making 2.0 along these lines? What's the obstacle there, or is it even an obstacle? Is it the water that we all swim in, and for that reason, we should be much more conscious about the role of politics?
There's so much to say there, and unfortunately, I'm not expert enough to say much of what needs to be said. So I'll just say 2 things I think will be helpful to you. First of all, a lot of people in countries we work in will cite the problem of political will. And so that's fine if people want to change, but suppose they don't want to change. And my point is that a lot of the hardest problems, let's take corruption, one of the areas I work on, where people will immediately say, but the power structure is corrupt too. Why would they ever want to change? And you have to say, well, look at all the elections that are going on right now where corruption is the first issue on the ballot. Look at Mexico. All the candidates are trying to outdo each other to swear they want to do something about corruption. Sometimes that's cynical, sometimes it's schizophrenic. Sometimes they really do want to get to a different equilibrium, but they're stuck in a situation, a kind of prisoner's dilemma, where everybody's bribing and everybody's paying campaign contributions, so I got to play the game too. And then the problem is, how do I move from here to something different 5 or 10 years from now? That's the premise I work on with them. So in short, political will, a second point, political will is there, but it's schizophrenic, if you don't mind me using that word. It's sort of secondly is political will is endogenous. It's often treated as one of those residuals, one of those heavy hammer explanations. The reason it didn't work, political will. How do you know? Well, it didn't work. So it's kind of a circular reasoning there. So unless you can identify political will in advance and measure it, then don't cite it afterwards. But what I find is when people resist change, oftentimes it's because they have an acute sense that you don't have of the risks. And they also have not seen success, and they are ignorant about what might be done. So an aphorism of relevance here is the ingredients of cynicism, or the antidote to cynicism is success. If you can show them that it can be done, and show them how they might do it without committing political suicide, political will can change quite a bit. So that's as much as I'll say about politics. There's a lot more to say about, is it a multi-party system? Is it and also the bright spots are very important. If you can find those things that are working already in a country, that's super important. It doesn't really answer your question, but yes. Okay, then we'll get.
Student here at Johns Hopkins, the second year. So in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about engagement and facilitation more from a project perspective. And then at the end of the presentation, you talked about what this means for universities, so more institutions-based. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts in terms of how do you think this can be integrated process-wise into institutions such as universities? To what extent do you focus mainly on decision makers, different types, the different functional units, et cetera? Thank you.
So since I don't quite capture your question, I'll do the trick that politicians use of answering a question I can answer. Okay? Maybe I can't even answer that very well, but if you're asking the question, does this technique, there's several questions, does this technique mostly apply to project design and implementation? No, it could be whole policy areas across ministries. It could be the design of an anti-corruption program for Philippines and so forth. Secondly, does it have to be for the elite leaders? I described a cabinet. No. This could be in a company. It could be a technique. Yesterday, I did a 2-day course at the IMF, and at the end of the day, I asked them, could you use this technique within the IMF itself for learning? And once they got their heads around that one, suddenly up came 10 ideas about, yeah, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. So it's just a way of being bold and humble with the research you do. Instead of doing this research in the IMF, we have the study, it shows this, so this is what our policy ought to be. That's not the ingredient. I don't know, does that approach your question, or are you having something else? Okay, come on up afterwards. You're welcome to puzzle me more. Shall we have one more? Deborah?
I have a quick question. I think I've sort of been a practitioner for a long time, and now I'm teaching, so I can see all of this in my work as well as in how and all the problems that I face, but also all the challenges in terms of my own teaching. What's really interesting, I think, is we get into this rut where we try to have a new approach. So you're trying to actually get people to puzzle through a problem differently by giving them a success story. What I've seen happen is that people then grab onto that success story and think that's the way they should do it in reality. Right? So because your approach of finding a success story is just telling them, hey, look, this is one way in which X solved it. But what ends up happening is that they say, oh, X solved it this way, therefore there must be more validity to it than my own approach.
You're right.
And then you're tinkering at the edges all over again.
Right.
So how do you get past that? How do you make it really, really clear that it's just an approach, it's not a solution?
So this is a great question, because a standard way that we in the outside help them make better decisions, we bring them best practices. We show them a blueprint, a story of how they did it. And we say, read that, let's talk about it, and do it. and we'll fund you, right? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, here's a case where there's a problem being faced by a new government or by an agricultural minister or by a NGO. And I've got to design this case very well, and I've got to prepare it to match their problem. That's my challenge. Then I bring this to them in a live case format where I present the problem, and they have to work on that problem. And they come up with ideas, their solutions to that problem. Then we see what the other guys did, and we talk about what ideas that gives them for their situation. They never come away and say, oh, okay, because they've been working the problem. They come up with other ideas, and each group has its ideas that were pretty good. And now we see what they did, and they don't come back and say, oh, okay, so they, oh, finally got the answer. So you never hit 17 in blackjack. Got it. It's not like that. Instead, they're stimulated to be more creative about their own situation. Does that make sense? I think it's also true with lots of things that we do. I think it's, as I said, I think it's true with counseling. I think it's true with teaching. It's not about the transfer of that best practice into you. And I don't want you to go away and say, therefore, we should do what happened in France. Not at all. And so we have this device set up so that is not what happens, I hope. All right, Chloe, good luck on your test. Okay. You remember the big thing to know about macroeconomics is macroeconomists are not sure yet whether the aggregate demand curve is vertical, Keynesian, or neo-Keynesian. Okay, just remember, they don't even know that. So if they can't even know that, just say, hey, come on, you guys, get out of here if you can. You don't know anything. Write that down and say, I'd heard that today at lunch. Well, thank you very much. I'll be up here afterwards if you'd like to talk, and I want to make sure you get off and do your midterms. Thanks very much for coming out today.